So good morning, everyone, afternoon or evening, depending on where you are today. Thank you for joining us, and thank you also for your patience as the plenary session ran a little bit longer this morning. My name is Carina Solmirano, and I am the coordinator of the ATT Monitor. And today, at the first day of the 7th Conference of States Parties to the ATT, it is a great pleasure for us to be able to have you at the launch of the ATT Monitor 2021 Annual Report. The ATT Monitor is an independent project of Control Arms, and it was established in 2015, right after the treaty became law. The annual report that we present today is the flagship publication of the project, and it takes a stock of existing practice. It creates greater transparency in how the treaty is implemented, informs the work of the CSPs and intersessional meetings, and assures accountability across the treaty commitments. Our project is currently funded by the governments of Germany, the Netherlands, and Sweden. Thank you to you. Before I start, I would like to just remind you that this is a webinar format, so any questions that you might have throughout the presentations, I'll ask you to send them through the Q&A tab in your screens. And for those of you participating through social media channels, I'll ask you to use the hashtags Arms Treaty, CSP7, and Monitor with the Monitor on your social media tweets. One final word before introducing you to our distinguished speakers is to extend a big thank to all the people that make this report possible, from our contributors, external peer reviewers, the members of our editorial team, fact checkers, translators, and designers. As you will see, this report involves a lot of work, and we hope that you will enjoy it. So without further delay, let me introduce you to our speakers who will deliver some brief remarks to open officially this event. Ambassador Lansana Gberie is the president of the 7th Conference of States Parties to the ATT and the permanent representative from Sierra Leone to the United Nations and other international organizations in Geneva. Ambassador Robert Gabrielse is the permanent representative of the Netherlands to the Conference on Disarmament and Disarmament Ambassador at Large. And finally, Mr. Rainer Schmiedchen is head of division at the German Federal Foreign Office, responsible for export control, conventional arms and dual-use goods, ATT, and the Wassenaar arrangement. Ambassador Gberie, you have the floor, and I know that you have also other commitments after these remarks, so we will excuse you to continue with your work. Thank you so much.
And I thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. I thank you very much, Excellency, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I'm deeply honored to participate at this event organized by Control Arms. Control Arms has been a very key partner of ours throughout this presidency, and I'm deeply, deeply honored for the support that I've had. I'm grateful for it, and I thank you very, very much. I thank the ATT Monitor for the invitation to deliver some remarks on the launch of the 2021 annual report. With the COVID-19 pandemic still impacting the work of multilateral processes, it's very important to continue counting on the contributions from civil society like you. You do extremely important work. Right from the beginning of my presidency, I made a point that civil society will be a key partner, and I'll continue this partnership, hopefully even beyond my presidency. I thank you for the support. The annual report that is being launched today is one of those contributions from civil society, very fundamental to the work that we do. And it has become a featured publication of the CSP process. It helps CIS parties and ATT stakeholders to advance the ATT's universalization and implementation, to identify key challenges in advancing global acceptance of the ATT's norms, and its full implementation and proposes steps to address some of these challenges. In addition, it provides recommendations for government policy planning and decision-making, and provides a research-based tool for everyone interested in the work of the ATT and arms control and everything. Each year, the ATT Monitor annual report explores themes that support the discussions of the ATT working groups and CSPS. It includes a comprehensive analysis of ATT's annual reports to assess the extent to which state parties are in compliance with their reporting obligations. The report also identifies good reporting practices and provide recommendations to state parties to support the submission of timely, accurate, and comprehensive information on the arms exports and imports. This year's report features a chapter on the CSP7 on our theme as president of the CSP7, which is strengthening efforts to eradicate the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons and ensure efficient stockpile management. The chapter analyzes stockpile management as a key mechanism for addressing the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons, and highlights synergies between ATT provisions and other global arms control frameworks like BOA, the Firearms Protocol, the International Tracing Instrument, and initiatives like Mosaic and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. I particularly commend the thorough analysis of the nature and dynamics of stockpile management practices in sub-Saharan Africa, as this shows the difficulties of harmonizing outdated stockpile management practices and policies to current international mechanisms. Stockpile management is a key mechanism to limit the potential that weapons will be diverted post-delivery. Effective national stockpile management can prevent illicit trade and diversion, as well as contribute to the effective implementation of the treaty. But poorly managed, insecure or unsafe stockpiles can be very vulnerable to theft, to looting, to corruption, and can cause great damage to societies and to individuals and human rights. Your chapter highlights that many states in sub-Saharan Africa have already identified a need for assistance in the area of stockpile management. However, as I read through the chapter, I find that the issue of stockpile management and illicit trade in small arms and light weapons not only affects Africa, although it is based on the experiences of my own continent, but it affects regions like Latin America and the Caribbean almost as well. I mean, we face very similar problems with respect to stockpile management. So this is a universal problem. As you know, my working paper, which is the theme of my presidency, we just had a long discussion on it actually, proposes a set of possible areas for state parties to consider for further inquiry and exchange or longer term implementation. The proposals contained in the working paper aim to address the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons and strengthen stockpile management and security. For instance, our first recommendation calls for the mapping and better utilization of existing guidance and tools on preventing the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons and strengthening stockpile management and security. And the third recommendation encourages state parties to the ATT to share information on effective and innovative stockpile management programs through updates to the ATT initial reports under section 7A1 of the ATT initial reporting template, plenary discussions, or the restricted area of ATT Secretariat website in order to inform and support efforts to prevent the illicit trafficking in SALW and their diversion under the ATT. In line with recommendation number 3 of my paper, this chapter highlights, for example, that only 6 state parties, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Liberia, Monaco, Norway, Samoa, and my own country, Sierra Leone, have referenced physical security and stockpile management in their initial reports. I therefore encourage state parties to share as appropriate information on effective and innovative stockpile management programs to updates to their ATT initial reports. Equally important, the chapter describes the different international and regional mechanisms on SALW control, which is the core of the first recommendation in my working paper. So I encourage state parties to better utilize and implement these mechanisms to avoid the risk of diversion from stockpiles into illicit markets and to illicit actors. Finally, let me reiterate my call upon all state parties to request assistance, including through the VTF mechanism and other international instruments to exchange information, best practices and challenges, and to cooperate with each other, especially after post-delivery, where the risks of stockpile theft and diversion may actually occur. The ATT monitor seeks to establish the highest possible international standards to improve the regulation of the international arms trade, and it plays a very invaluable role in tracking the progress of the ATT implementation mechanism. It is a timely and very useful guidance tool for all stakeholders. I encourage everyone to read this report and incorporate its findings in all our efforts towards eradicating the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons and ensuring efficient stockpile management. I thank you for your attention, and I thank you for this meeting. Good luck with your discussions. I would have loved to join in to listen to other panelists, but I have another meeting. My foreign minister is in town, and we have scheduled a number of other bilateral meetings, and I have to accompany him to those meetings. So there's no rest for this week. I thank you so very much, and good luck with your discussions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ambassador, and thank you for your leadership as well. Thank you. Now let's go to Ambassador Robert Gabrielse. You have the screen, please.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank Control Arms for inviting me to join in the launch event of the ATT Monitor 2021, and also like to thank the President. I think he gave off with a good start and a good introduction, but also this morning with the ATT, actually this afternoon in Geneva, and I wish him good luck for the rest of the week. Thank you also for the other panelists. I will not speak long because I know there's very much experts here online who have much more knowledge than I have, so I will keep it short. And I also like to thank all those participating in this webinar. The Netherlands is proud to be a long-term supporter of the ATT Monitor, and the ATT Monitor has become an integral part of our annual stock taking on the implementation of the ATT, as also the President mentioned. And such stock taking is especially important for a relatively young treaty, such as the ATT, to allow us to compare notes and learn from each other on how to implement the treaty fully and properly. This year's report is the 5th year of such stock taking. So many congratulations to Control Arms on this anniversary, and many thanks for establishing this consistent, open, and systematic track record of ATT implementation. The reporting obligations under the ATT are the lifeblood of the ATT process. Only real transparency on arms flow and the decisions by state parties on authorizations makes it possible for us as ATT stakeholders to have a real, informed, and meaningful discussion on whether the ATT works and whether we are collectively doing enough to let the ATT reach its full potential. For this reason, the Netherlands strives to be as transparent as possible. We publish up-to-date overview every 2 months that show which authorizations were granted and which were denied. We stand ready to discuss our decisions with stakeholders. Equally, we continually try to improve our reporting. This year, our annual report on arms control to our national parliament has been revamped. We benefited greatly from input we received from ATT stakeholders, such as Small Arms Survey and the recommendation from previous ATT monitors. The report now includes more information on dual-use experts, has a dedicated paragraph on authorizations on brokering services, and includes more information on actual transfers on the general licenses. We can still do better, for example, by updating our initial report for the ATT. It's on our radar. We will continue to strive to increase transparency wherever possible and encourage other countries to do the same. We stand ready to share our experiences and practice. So thank you, Control Arms, for keeping us on track and showing us how we can do better. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you as well for your continued support of our work. That's greatly appreciated. Finally, but not least, Mr. Schmiedchen, please, your remarks.
Good afternoon to everyone, or good morning to those in the US. Ms. Solmirano, I'm really honored to be invited here. It's for me, it's double strange because for the first time after 2 years, I'm abroad in Geneva here for CSP7. I even got a vaccination to take part in this important meeting. And yeah, indeed, rapidly changing environment, not only because of the COVID situation, but I feel what we experienced during the last 3 weeks is one of the biggest diversion of weapons, of conventional weapons, which the world has ever seen. I don't want to mention the country, but it's frightening for at least the German analysts. 7 years after the formal ratifications, the ATT is on a good way, on the one hand. On the other hand, the overall goal has not yet reached. The universalization of the treaty, big exporters are still missing. And now coming to Control Arms and the ATT monitor, we think, the German point of view, that it is an important and independent project for an overall analysis on how states behave and act with regard to their treaty obligations. Somewhere I read that it was a transparency tool, the ATT monitor, and I think those who say that are right. The colleagues at Control Arms are investing huge efforts to analyze the current statuses of implementation of the ATT in each state every year. Their work helps us to understand the current status in the most important fields of the treaty, such as reporting, transparency, and effective and cooperative action between ATT stakeholders. And now, as it is still not formally launched, but I want to put it here in the camera, what I liked most was in the monitor was the Ghana case study and everything that was written on private reporting. I found somewhere written that the treaty universalization is important, but perhaps more important would be a drive to reporting universalization. In the past, Germany actively supported Control Arms in developing the project. And yeah, I think I can say we are more or less ready to support Control Arms in the future too. That's what I wanted to say in any case. I would like to Control Arms for the continued support of the ATT. And of course, I would like to thank you also as a good project partner of the Germans. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much to you. And we're happy that you like also the case study of which I will be speaking very soon. Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you again for the support that your governments provide to civil society projects like the ATT Monitor and Control Arms more in general. So if you allow me now, Katherine, would you be able to share the screen so we can actually start with the monitor? One piece of promotion is that the ATT Monitor is already live on our website, www.attmonitor.org. So you will be able to not only download the full report, but also the executive summaries that we present in 3 languages as we started doing last year. And also we are sharing the link for you right now on the chat screen. So I would like now to turn the attention to the presentation of the main findings of the annual report 2021. I will be quite brief because the main information will be provided by Katherine and Rachel, but I actually wanted to take on Ambassador Gberie's words and tell you a little bit about the first or the thematic chapter that we develop for this year. So if we can go to the next slide. So this is something that we do, we've been doing for quite some years now, which is basically to follow the presidency theme and develop an analytical piece of work that we can share with all ATT stakeholders, but also to support the presidency in the ways that Control Arms has been doing for the past couple of years. So the chapter begins by looking at stockpile management as a crucial mechanism for addressing the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons, both in the context of the ATT, but also in the context of other global and regional arms control instruments. And so we start by providing some key definitions on this topic that you see there. Basically, stockpile safety and stockpile security. And we develop in the chapter other types of definitions and understandings that the community has on these issues over the last couple of years. And so if we go to the next one, stockpile management, so as Ambassador Gberie mentioned, is also a mechanism to limit the potential for the diversion of weapons into illicit hands or illicit markets. Article 11, for example, establishes provisions to address diversion at the different stages of the transfer chain, including a stockpile management, which we normally find at the last stage of the transfer chain. One very important article, in addition to Article 11, is also Article 16, which encourages the participation of all states parties to seek assistance and support in implementing the broad array of measures that might decrease the risk of diversion. And so stockpile management is one of those areas where states parties can request assistance. We also look into Article 15 on international cooperation and Article 12 on record keeping as parts of the ATT that are very relevant in the context of today's discussion. As Ambassador Gberie said, these specific ATT provisions can also be implemented in synergy with other global instruments such as the Firearms Protocol, the UN Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons, and the International Tracing Instrument, but also of other initiatives like the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. So the second part of the chapter analyzes in more detail the nature and dynamics of stockpile management practices in sub-Saharan Africa. And one thing that we develop in the chapter is that, with more than a dozen active conflicts in the region and an uncontrolled circulation of small arms and light weapons, we found that this issue is particularly critical for sub-Saharan Africa. Throughout the chapter, we explore how the legacy of past norms inherited by African states still has impacts on the current implementation of small arms and light weapons control in the region. We observe that the growing increase in weapons in official stockpiles during the Cold War, for example, was not matched with effective stockpile management policies or reforms to colonial era legislation. And so after the Cold War, an array of arms control instruments emerged in the region. Some of them were mentioned today during the plenary session. And all of these instruments contain specific provisions on stockpile management. And yet, despite all these regional efforts, we observe that there are multiple challenges in sub-Saharan Africa to effectively implement these provisions. So if we go to the next slide, please. So we, in this chapter, we illustrate these challenges by looking into a very detailed case of the challenges faced by Ghana and establishing and implementing stockpile management systems. And although Ghana is a country that sort of stands out, especially in the West Africa region, for having been a peaceful and relatively stable democracy, they still have a series of security challenges that they face today, increasingly growing from terrorism and transnational crime. But in looking at the challenges that Ghana has these days, you can see them summarized here in the slide in these 5 points. Problematic historical legacies, which might be found also in other countries in the region, It's this coordination between the current legislation that is still informed by old colonial era legislations, and that it makes very difficult to implement the more modern stockpile management systems. And also challenges with interagency cooperation when you have multiple norms and multiple agencies implementing different approaches to stockpile management and stockpile security. There is a lack of cohesive approach to the issue. Another issue that I'm sure it crosses many countries, not only in sub-Saharan Africa, but in general in the global South, is the outdated stockpile management systems and infrastructure. Just today, to give you an example, this morning in the news in Argentina, we heard that a criminal band or a criminal gang tried to assault a military depot to steal weapons. And fortunately, the alarms were on and the whole incident was avoided. But this is something that touches all of us. And so we take a look also in Ghana, what the poor infrastructure sometimes or outdated record keeping systems, can be an obstacle to safely manage their stockpiles. We then look into the illicit locally manufactured firearms. And this is a very important point, not only in Ghana, but in other countries as far as we mapped. The artisanal or locally manufactured weapons in Ghana, these weapons are illegal or are prohibited by law, but they continue to be manufactured, and they account actually for a large portion of the locally owned small arms and light weapons. And finally, we look into how the national legal frameworks sometimes have difficulties to match and to live up to the regional commitments that Ghana has made. And so this is the final kind of point of analysis. So we end up the chapter by encouraging states to make use of these different ATT and other regional and international instruments, in particular Article 16, for instance, of the ATT on assistance. We know that many states in the sub-Saharan region are already beneficiaries of the Voluntary Trust Fund, and the fund remains actually a very good platform for states parties in need of improving their stockpile systems. So with that, I would now like to turn the attention to the following parts of the annual report. And so I will give the word and the floor to my colleague, Katherine Young. She's a senior researcher with the project. And after Katherine, we will have Mrs. Rachel Stohl, sorry, Rachel, who is the Vice President of the Stimson Center. Both of you will have about 15 minutes for your presentations. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Carina, and thanks to our panelists and everyone who has joined us today at the beginning of what we can already see will be another busy week of meetings and side events. So we've already heard a lot about the role of ATT reporting in promoting transparency and why it's important. So today, we'll take a much closer look at the role of reporting in doing so, in line with the object and purpose of the treaty. So my job today is to share the report and provide some context and guidance on accessing the different types of information we present in it, while also walking through some of its key findings. So as you can see here, the report is divided into 5 main sections. The first of which is the year in review, which gives a snapshot of where the treaty stands regarding universalization, reporting and compliance, and CSP systems and procedures. And second, Carina just walked us through chapter 1, which is our special section, and this year reflects the CSP7 presidency's priority theme for the conference. Then the remainder of the report focuses on reporting obligations and transparency commitments. So in addition to our regular year-to-year analysis that we provide for you, chapter 2 is a special feature this year. So with the generous support of Germany, we were able to undertake a review of the first 5 years of ATT reporting. And I'm very happy to be able to share the findings of this review with you today. I'll be looking at ATT annual reports, and Rachel will share more information about initial reports. And chapter 3 then is a return to our usual findings and includes a detailed analysis of 2019 ATT annual reports. And these detail imports and exports from the 2019 calendar year and were due on the 31st of May in 2020. And as you likely know by now, our ATT Monitor reports provide detailed information on ATT annual reports submitted in the previous year to give us sufficient time for in-depth analysis. And then Chapter 4 includes a preliminary review of 2020 annual reports, which detail imports and exports from the 2020 calendar year and were due on May 31st of this year. And then Chapter 4 also details ATT initial reports up to our cutoff date for analysis in June 2021, and Rachel will cover that for us later on as well. So before we jump into ATT annual reports, there are a few points from our year in review I'd like to highlight. In terms of universalization, between this year's ATT Monitor report and last year's, 4 countries became ATT states parties, and that's China, Sao Tome and Principe, Afghanistan, and Niue. And this nearly matches the universalization rate of the previous year, which also saw the addition of 4 new states parties. So with the exception of the 2018 to 2019 time period when 7 countries ratified the treaty, universalization progress has remained relatively consistent in recent years. And while of course we would like to see this number and rate increase, this is ultimately a bit of good news given challenges posed by COVID-19 and the shifting of priorities for governments all over the world this past year and a half. And if you're interested in seeing when these states are due to submit initial reports or their first annual reports, you can visit the interactive map on the ATT Monitor website. So the year in review also captures the key findings of our analysis of ATT reporting. And again, this includes both 2019 and 2020 annual reports, as well as initial reports submitted up to June 2021. And I think the big headlines here are not surprising. In the context of annual reports, compliance with ATT reporting obligations is declining. The number of reports do increase each year, but the number of reports submitted do not. And more states parties are opting to keep reports confidential. Both of these trends are posing challenges to transparency in the global arms trade, and we'll look more at that in the 5-year review as I go through. We also see that there's a group of states parties that is consistently compliant with reporting obligations and contributes to the transparency aims and objectives of the treaty. And more good news this year is that there is a number of states parties that submitted past due reports. It's both initial and annual reports, which is a good practice that helps eliminate the stigma of late reporting. So it doesn't matter how late the report is, we would still like to see it submitted. So I'm going to focus mostly on the 5-year review of annual reports, but wanted to quickly highlight our regular analysis in Chapter 2. So this chapter covers a lot of ground because it's our in-depth analysis of 2019 annual reports and includes our country profiles. And generally, we look at the quantity of reports submitted and states parties' compliance with reporting obligations, and then we take a closer look at the quality of the information provided in these reports. And as this is covered also in the 5-year review, I won't go into great detail, but wanted to quickly touch on one aspect of reporting, and that's late reporting. So each year, the ATT Monitor establishes a cutoff date of analysis of February 1st. And we may have 1 or 2 states parties that submit reports after this date, but this year we saw the highest rate of late reporting yet. And we had 7 states parties submit reports, 2019 reports, after our February 1st cutoff dates. So these reports are evaluated in the 5-year review, but not in this section and not in the country profiles. And overall, there were 11 states parties that submitted late 2019 reports, despite having submitted on-time reports for the previous year. So that's a much higher number than we normally see. And I highlight this now in part to take stock of the effects of COVID-19 reporting this past year, which likely did impact states' ability to submit reports on time. And as I mentioned, Chapter 3 also includes our country profile analysis, which we're happy to provide each year. And here are the 45 publicly available 2019 annual reports form the basis of analysis as in previous years. So each profile provides data on key reporting practice metrics, as well as a summary of areas of good practice and areas for improvement. And the profiles also contain a summary of transfers reported by each state party, which includes basic comparable information such as import and export partners and overall numbers of weapons categories and subcategories. And for the first time this year, we've also included information on reports submitted and made publicly available or confidential in the last 5 years. And the idea here was to give a better, more useful snapshot of reporting practice. These profiles are dense and full of information, so I will direct you either to the ATT Monitor annual report, or in a week or so, they will also be available on our website, where we've made country profiles from 2016 onwards available for download directly. So do check back then. All right, so now I will walk you through the annual report section of our 5-year review. And this chapter evaluates the first 5 years of ATT annual reporting, which includes 2015 to 2019 annual reports, to determine whether such reporting has lived up to the promise and requirements of the ATT. And what we find is that progress here has been slow, and reporting has yet to live up to these promises. In this analysis, we look to 3 reporting categories to see if reports were fully compliant with Article 13.3 reporting obligations, whether reports contribute to the transparency aims and objectives of the treaty and, as such, are meaningfully transparent, and whether reports contribute to a higher standard of transparency, going beyond the minimum we would look for. And for each reporting category, we established specific criteria upon which annual reports were evaluated, which I'll briefly highlight as I go through each category. And we undertook distinct evaluation exercises for each category to distinguish between reporting obligations and the minimum amount of information the ATT Monitor has determined is needed for reports to fulfill the transparency aims and objectives of the treaty. So, for example, a report could be submitted after the reporting deadline and not be compliant with Article 13.3 obligations fully, but could also contribute positively to the transparency aims and objectives of the treaty. So the ATT Monitor considers a report fully compliant with Article 13.3 if one is submitted to the ATT Secretariat, is submitted within 1 week of the May 31st deadline, and this is the grace period extended by the ATT Secretariat, and a report includes both exports and imports and or relevant nil reports, because Article 13 makes clear the obligation to submit annual reports detailing both exports and imports. So we found that in 5 years' time, the percentage of states parties submitting annual reports has declined from 82% of 2015 reports to 64% of 2019 reports. And then we consider, and when we consider compliance with all Article 13.3 requirements, less than half of states parties have fulfilled them all in any given year, which you can see here. The peak was in 2018 with a dip in 2019, which was in part the result of high numbers of late reporting. So next we looked to determine whether reports fulfilled transparency aims and objectives of the treaty, and as such were meaningfully transparent. And the criteria we used are listed here, and it includes reports that are submitted and made publicly available, include information that is disaggregated, indicates actual and or authorized transfers, provides numbers and or values for each weapon type. And what we found here is that the percentage of reports each year that are meaningfully transparent is declining, and that's due largely to the overall declining compliance rates and increasing rates of confidential reporting. And that this decline is not offset by any significant improvement in the transparency of information provided in reports. And then when we look at publicly available reports, the percentage of them that are meaningfully transparent has remained relatively consistent. And that to us indicates that capacity among states parties may also have remained static. So you can see in both these figures, the number of meaningfully transparent reports is the same. The first figure shows the percentage of reports due that are meaningfully transparent. So as the number of reports due increases, the percentage of transparent reports decreases. And again, this is due largely to the decreasing reporting rate and increasing rate of confidential reporting. And then the second figure shows the percentage of submitted publicly available reports that are meaningfully transparent according to the criteria above. So of the reports that are actually submitted publicly each year, the percentage of transparent reports is relatively consistent. And again, that's because we know there's a group of states that report consistently every year, and this figure suggests that capacity has remained static as well. And then next we look to see whether reports went above and beyond the minimum amount of information we'd hope to see, ultimately contributing to a higher standard of transparency. And I've listed the criteria here for you. So no one state regularly provided all of this additional information, nor would we expect that to be the case. So we've looked at each criterion individually. So what we found, as an example, was that a group of states parties, and this is the group we know are consistently submitting publicly available reports each year, has increased the occurrence of comments describing the nature of reported transfers, as well as descriptions of the items transferred over the course of 5 years. So as above, looking at these two figures, we can see that in the first, the percentage of reports due that include descriptions of arms transferred decreases as the number of due reports increases, but the percentage of publicly available reports in the second figure that include descriptions has increased slightly over time. So I really encourage you to take a look through this chapter. We have a lot of findings that unfortunately I can't share with you. We would need a lot more time in order for me to do that. But overall, I wanted to share two points. The first of which is that there were only 12 states parties that were both fully compliant with Article 13.3 obligations and submitted meaningfully transparent reports for every year that a report was due. And there were only 8 states parties that did both of those, but also included information that contributed to a higher standard of transparency each year. So there's a lot more to be done, and without improved compliance with these obligations and commitments to meaningfully transparent reporting, the ATT won't be able to live up to its original intent. So finally, for the remainder of the report, which in part identifies some of these challenges to reporting, I will kindly look to Rachel now to take us through these findings. Thank you.
Thank you, Katherine. Rachel, you have the screen, the screen for now.
Thank you. Oh, I got to go back in my slides here. Sorry, not those who know me know I'm not super technically savvy. Thank you, Carina, and thank you to the ATT Monitor and to the funders of this really important initiative, particularly the Netherlands and Germany, who also support my work on reporting. I think it's really valuable to have this event each year and this publication each year, and I'm really honored to continue to be a part of it. I think everyone here today has really laid out how reporting is essential to understanding how states parties interpret the treaty's obligations, where the crucial gaps in implementation remain. And again, as Katherine just said, this goal of increasing transparency of and confidence in the global arms trade, all of which are crucial to ensuring the ATT's success, but also the universalization, not only of the treaty itself, but of the principles and values in that treaty. So as Katherine mentioned, this presentation is really going to look at both ATT initial reports as are required by states parties, and the latest round, sort of a preview of the full picture of 2020 annual reports. So let's start with our initial report analysis. As all of you know, the ATT in Article 13.1 require states to submit an annual report within the first year after entry into force for that state party. That means that deadline submissions differ from country to country, but there are many longtime states parties that have yet to complete their initial reports, which lead to a less than complete picture of ATT implementation. So the monitor chapter reflects data on the status of ATT reporting as of 7 June 2021. But given, as Katherine mentioned, there have been some late submissions, I'm going to try and in this presentation include some of those newer reporters, even if they're not reflected in the ATT monitor's text. And we assure you they will be for next year, but just their publication deadline. So I always get sort of a grumpy email saying we did submit our report, and so we recognize that, just not by the June 7 deadline. So as of August 24th of this year, 106 states parties were required to submit their initial report. 81 states have done so, which is a compliance rate of 76%. And even though there are newer states parties, and that number keeps growing, and that's great, the level of compliance for initial reports has remained relatively constant over time. There are 5 states parties that have submitted their initial reports since the publication of last year's ATT monitor. There were also 5 states parties that were due to submit their initial reports to the ATT Secretariat. 3 of those new parties did submit their initial report, and the other 2 are states parties that belatedly submitted their initial reports, and that's great. It's never too late to submit your initial report, so feel free to do that even if the deadline has passed. What is a little bit troubling is that 3 of these 5 new reports that have been submitted within the last year are private reports. And I'll come back to, and Katherine also mentioned this trend towards private reporting. This private reporting really represents a growing challenge, not just for our efforts to analyze the treaty, but also for efforts to monitor and assess the ATT's impact, to identify gaps in or available capacity for supporting comprehensive implementation. So this is really a worrying trend for us. The number of states parties that remain non-compliant also remains relatively constant. There are 25 states parties that now have not completed their initial reports. I do also want to mention updating of initial reports, because I think sometimes that gets lost in our discussion of submitting reports. There is a treaty requirement to provide updates to initial reports and to provide the ATT Secretariat on any new measures that are undertaken in order to implement the treaty. Since the publication of last year's ATT monitor, we have 1 additional state, Hungary, that has submitted their updated report. And so now we have 5 states parties total that have submitted their initial reports, and we really appreciate that. But I know, based on conversations, based on seeing what states parties are doing, that there are many more states that could update the measures that they've taken to implement the treaty, whether it's updating control lists or new legislation, new points of contact even are very welcome additions to reporting. There is no standard template or reporting mechanism for updating initial reports, but any mechanism at this point is welcome. Any format to send to the Secretariat would be fantastic. I do want to mention a few trends that we're seeing in initial reports. As I said, you can see from this chart, it's pretty across the board, a constant compliance rate with initial report submissions. But many states do continue to have difficulties in meeting their requirement. And a lot of this is not because states just don't want to submit their reports, but there are challenges with available resources and or capacity. There may be potential uncertainty around reporting requirements and deadlines. And there is, of course, the lack of political will and prioritization of meeting these treaty obligations. And so explaining and reminding states why reporting is so important is essential to seeing reporting success. And when we've seen outreach and workshops and working with states parties on helping them complete their reports, you will see states parties very eager to complete their reports and submit them. So that individual outreach is really important. If we look at a very worrying trend that I mentioned at the outset, is that we see private reporting continue to be an increasing issue. Private reports can only be viewed by other states' parties, and that limits public understanding, analysis, insight, development of trends, development of assistance regarding states' parties and their interpretation and implementation of the treaty's provision. It really impedes our ability to work with states to identify potential assistance that might be needed or to help fill gaps. If we look at the most recent statistics that we have, of the 81 submitted initial reports to date, 17 are private, which is about 21% of all submitted initial reports. And we're seeing them become a greater and greater share of submitted initial reports. And so we need to think about how we can address that. Another issue, and I'm very glad that the working group on transparency and reporting is addressing this at this CSP, but there are challenges to the reporting templates themselves. This is a priority for the working group, so I'm not going to go too much into it, but there seems to be three main challenges that states have identified: the language and statements used in the reporting template, the format of certain questions, and omitted content. And all of those issues are being addressed by the revisions that the working group has provided for the discussion at this CSP. So it's going to be really important to monitor progress towards revising the templates and continuing to engage states on what good reporting practice looks like to ensure some consistency and comparability of the reporting templates over time. And just a last few general comments on the initial reports. As Katherine mentioned, and the monitor itself goes into great detail about the trends of the first 5 years, but we're not seeing that compliance or promise of the treaty's reporting efforts be realized. And I think that there are numerous challenges that we've identified that hinder our ability to gain a complete picture of ATT reporting and implementation. I want to, if you look back at Article 1 and the object and purpose of the treaty, transparency is a central part of that. If we don't see universal compliance, it's really impossible for us to identify good practice, lessons learned, improve national practice to ensure that arms transfers do not contribute to human suffering. And we can't generally analyze whether the ATT is having the desired effect in more effectively regulating global arms transfers. So I'm hopeful that as we continue to discuss reporting in this context, we will see some improvements. I want to quickly move to annual reports because I think there we see sort of in real time how states are able to comply with the treaty's reporting requirements and identify some additional trends. So as Katherine mentioned, Article 13.3 requires every state to submit an annual report by 31 May of each year that reflects the transfers that are made in the previous calendar year. There's a 7-day grace period. So again, we have this June 7 sort of de facto deadline for reporting. If we look at the 2020 reports received so far, and I recognize it's August, Katherine mentioned that there were still 7 of last year's that were received after February. So I recognize there are still some to be received. We do see that this is an on-time compliance rate of this year of only 44%, which is much better than last year, but still has a way to go in terms of reaching even the halfway point of compliance. I think there's probably some effects continuing of the COVID-19 pandemic, but if you look at this on-time completion rate over the first 6 years of the treaty, you'll see it's usually in the 40%. And so again, trying to prioritize and remind states of deadlines will be really important. If we look though at just over the last 2 months since we stopped work on the monitor chapter, another 11 states parties have submitted their initial report, or sorry, their annual reports. So we now have 57, which gets us up to a 54% compliance rate, which still has lots of room for improvement, but obviously is in the direction that we would like to see. If we look quickly at the annual reports received so far, of the 57 reports that have been received, 16 of those are private, which is 28% of all the reports that are submitted so far. And again, if we just look at last year alone, that's an increase from the 2019 reports. Again, if we look at the purpose of annual reports and identifying trends and transfers and looking for ways in which we see how states are interpreting their treaty obligations, we know that private annual reports are challenging our ability to see that transparency, hinder public accounting of global arms transfers, and obstruct efforts to identify potentially problematic sales, potentially dangerous accumulations of sales. If we also continue to look at how states are embracing their reporting obligations, there were 8 states parties that were required to submit their first annual reports. And as of August 24th, 3 of those 8 states parties had done so. And so that is also somewhat concerning that it is not sort of a part of the onboarding of the treaty that there is a reminder to internally to submit those reports. So we're looking forward to working with new states parties to ensure they understand their reporting deadlines. Again, I do believe that COVID has disrupted many work dynamics. It's delayed scheduling. It's overall hampered the reporting capacities of many states parties, particularly those that didn't have a standard process in place. And so I'm hopeful that we see these 2 years of 2019 and 2020 reports as sort of an anomaly. When we look back 20 years from now at reporting, we see how those were outlier years. But it's important that we keep those trends at the forefront of our minds so that we are able to correct the pattern. We've had, as Katherine mentioned in her overview, you have states that are regularly in compliance. We have 41 states parties that have submitted their annual reports for every year that they were required to do so. And notably, we have one state party who actually went back and submitted an annual report for the first time this year, even though it had never done so before. So that's a really welcome trend, that it's, again, never too late to start with your annual reports. And you can even go back in time and submit reports for previous years if those were not submitted. I just want to, I'm conscious of time and leaving the time for questions. So I just want to mention a couple of the things that Katherine mentioned in her list of what factors are utilized to see how states are reporting. We have 8 states parties used the online reporting tool this year. We have 3 states parties that indicated that they submitted nil reports for exports, and 3 states parties that were nil reports for imports. Those were not necessarily the same 3 states. We have 6 states parties that indicated that they withheld some commercially sensitive or national security related data from their annual reports. Those are publicly available reports, so there could be additional information withheld from private reports. But again, just because you're withholding some information doesn't mean the entirety of the report needs to be private. And so we appreciate that level of transparency. And we have 5 states parties that indicated their reports contained information on national definitions and categories. And again, that additional information is really helpful for trying to analyze some trends. Given the shortness of time, I do want to just mention that the chapter goes very much into specific details on exports and imports and the reports that are submitted, and looking at, for example, whether states reported on actual exports or authorizations. Some provided both. The same with imports. We looked at both actual and authorized imports. But interestingly as well, there are often differences in how states report major conventional weapons and small arms and light weapons. And so we analyze that in the chapter as well, looking at the differences in reporting between major conventional weapons and small arms and light weapons. So just some concluding thoughts as I end. You know, I think as we look at this year as again disrupted by the COVID pandemic, governments are beginning to adapt their processes and are starting to return to the issues of treaty compliance that fell off the sort of priority list last year. I think, though, that while annual reporting is up from 2020's ATT monitor, we are seeing a troublingly low compliance rate across the board for ATT reporting. And I think we need to remind states of the importance and necessity of fulfilling their ATT reporting requirements. And it's not just a box ticking exercise that you've done this, it has real purpose and value. I think this increase in private reporting, which I know I sound like a broken record each year when I give this presentation, is still really alarming, and it is only increasing. It's not even leveling off. It is getting bigger each year. And without, I think, this global and comprehensive picture of arms transfers, it's really challenging for us to identify the success or challenges of the ATT. I do think there are some bright spots in this year's annual reports. We have states parties that provided past reports. That's a great example for others to follow, that it is always welcome and encouraged to submit reports, even if they're late. Reporting compliance by first-time states parties is also a great sign that states are recognizing their reporting obligation. I think the ATT Secretariat has really been helpful in reminding states of their deadlines. The prioritization of revising the templates by the Working Group on Transparency Reporting is very welcome, and states parties themselves can continue to have these conversations. I'm really happy to answer any questions that you all might have, and I just want to, I will put this in the chat, highlight some new fact sheets that Stimson has put out as of today that look at different aspects of reporting, including reporting obligations, reporting compliance, this issue of private reporting, and also look at reporting challenges and what is preventing states from being compliant with reporting. So I'll put that link in the chat for those who would like to look at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And we will also share in a follow-up email, you know, not only the presentations, but also the fact sheets, you know, the copies of the annual report for everyone to see, in case, you know, especially for people that have to leave early or couldn't attend today. So we're running a little bit late. We started late, but we have a few minutes for a Q&A. So I'm going to start with one question that was sent as you ladies were presenting today. So the question is, wondering if the monitor has a means for accessing or assessing unreported arms transfers. In the case of Mexico, whose reports are detailed and on time, we have found some significant firearms imports that were not included in their annual reports. Without comparisons to other data sources, it can be difficult to fully assess their reports. So I think, you know, both Rachel and Katherine, you have been looking at this in greater detail. If you want to say some words about this, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah. I think at this point in time, you know, the ATT monitor spends a great deal of effort looking at the degree to which reports are comprehensive, timely, publicly available, and so on. But yeah, I think the question is spot on in pointing to the fact that assessing accuracy of the information that's presented is in many ways a different exercise. The ATT monitor in the past has undergone a discrepancy analysis where we did look to see if we could compare exports and imports as a means of diving a little bit deeper into the actual data, to at least in the context of the reports themselves, without going to other data sources, try and identify where transfers might be missing. I think being able to assess the accuracy of the reports for the ATT monitor would be a dream. But in order to do that, because there are so many data sources and so much information in different places related to arms exports and imports, it would be challenging at this point for us to undertake that as part of the analysis. But we are looking for ways to do more of this in the future, and even Carina could speak more about that if she'd like.
Thank you. We are actually doing a paper that is going to be ready by the end of the year, in which we will try to assess whether we can detect unreported arms transfers in certain contexts where ongoing conflicts are going on. So stay tuned for that. But yeah, like Katherine said, it's an analysis that we would like to undertake in the future, if possible, a little bit based on the discrepancy analysis, but also on improving the methodology of the type of explorations that the ATT monitor did a couple of years ago. Rachel?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think also with regards to the initial reports, what's interesting about the 25 countries that have not yet submitted an initial report is many of them, 19 to be exact, have experience with submitting national reports on implementation of, for example, the program of action. And we've talked about in the ATT monitor before, the synergies between the ATT and the program of action. And so there are examples of where states maybe don't fully recognize the importance of reporting to the ATT, or don't realize that there's so much overlap between their POA reports. 6 of those 19, in fact, submitted a 2020 annual UN POA report. So we know that it is possible to submit those annual reports. It's just getting states to do so. And I would just highlight also on the exports and imports, again, we have states that have submitted in the past to the UN register that have not submitted to the ATT, and sometimes even vice versa. So I think, again, understanding the synergies, working within the bureaucratic infrastructure to have a timeline and a plan for completing all of the reports that have synergies amongst them can actually support states in fulfilling all of their reporting requirements and not having to pick and choose which ones to report to.
Thank you. Yeah. Also, yeah, exactly. The synergies with other international instruments, the POA, and also UN ROCA, are very relevant in this context. I have a second question here. Have you heard of instances where states or others are looking at the specific ATT country reports and asking states questions about them? In other words, examples of their reports being used perhaps to understand why decisions were taken, or assessing possible concerns about potential adversaries being armed. Chachan. No. Katherine, you have had some feedback sometimes about the way that country profiles are used by stakeholders.
Absolutely, yes. Yes, so fortunately, I've had the opportunity to talk with a number of states parties about the information that we include in not only the country profiles, but in the other parts of analysis that we present along with the country profiles, or in the past, the discrepancy analysis as well. So really, any time where we are presenting information that details exports and imports, we do have governments that initiate discussion with us. Whether or not they're initiating discussion with each other, I think in some cases, yes, but I think it's more frequently in the context of, again, exports and imports, seeing what is going to whom, and whether or not the other state is also reporting that as well. So I think it would be great if governments use these resources to have a deeper look at implementation and what that might mean for international cooperation and so on. And if there are governments who have done that, we would be thrilled to hear about it.
Thank you very much. Rachel, no. I don't have any other questions here, but I do have a question, a more general one, and perhaps it's directed to Rachel, only because the focus of our thematic chapter was on stockpile management, and we look into Africa, right? We would have loved to do a further analysis of other regions where, like Latin America, where we face similar problems when it comes to our stockpile. What do we know about initial reports and stockpile management? What is it that states sometimes, present us information or not? I know that you did a little bit of that mapping for the specifics of this study.
Yes, so I believe Ambassador Gberie mentioned the statistic that there are only 6 states that have provided any information about stockpile management in their initial reports. And that was after we did a screen using lots of keywords that really could be interpreted as widely as possible on this theme. And I think the challenge is states parties aren't always thinking comprehensively about all of their measures that they take to implement the treaty. So even if it is not a specific element or a specific obligation, there are things that states are doing on stockpile management, which lead to greater national controls and prevention of diversion, for example. So some of those mentions had to do with preventing or addressing diversion challenges. Some were about assistance that had been received or assistance that had been provided on the topic of stockpile management, but certainly it was not a topic that was comprehensively addressed across the board. And I would say that in some cases, doing an analysis of the initial reports is often quite frustrating because, well, for many reasons, but primarily because we know states are doing more than they actually tell us about. We know because we've partnered with them on workshops or exercises or policy implementation. We know because they've talked about it or presented on it in other forums. We know they've reported on it in, say, the UNPOA context, which has a much more detailed description of stockpile management and efforts within their report. And so we'd like to see, again, more information provided by states so that we can more accurately reflect the ways in which states are interpreting the ATT that provide really good lessons learned or good practice for other states to adopt. So this, again, isn't just we just want to know because we're nosy and we want to name and shame those that aren't doing this. On the contrary, we want to really highlight the things that states are doing well and provide assistance to those states that may need extra capacity or extra resources and able to see the ATT's full effect.
Thank you so much. I was going to mention, the role of international cooperation and sharing information and best practices among countries, especially the developed ones, like here, Germany and the Netherlands, right, with countries that are perhaps a little bit less developed in their reporting practices. I know that our colleague from Germany has to go to another commitment, so I don't want to take a lot of your time. I know it's been a very long day for all of us, for being the first day of CSP7, but I wanted to thank you again, all of you, for attending, for staying, and of course, I encourage you to read all the material. We will be sending you a follow-up email, so open it. You might find a lot of interesting information in the coming days. So good luck to all of you. Thank you once again. And sorry, I have some back noise. They are working on the next door's house. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.